Hey everybody, Scott Roger Chafian here from Authentic with Brian Sunshine Sinclair giving an update on the Gettysburg shootdown of the Red Ripper F-18 in the Red Sea just before Christmas. Shine, how are you doing today?
Happy New Year, Roger. Doing well. How about you, sir?
Doing great. Happy New Year to you
Good.
as well.
Thank you.
Most of you are probably used to listening to Shine and I on podcasts on Authentic. We're doing this on YouTube because there's some visual aspects to this that I think are going to be critical, and we'll be showing you some pictures and some diagrams and so on and so forth. But if you're new to this on YouTube with Shine and I, we'll give you just a quick background on who we are. As I said, Scott Roger Chafian, actually a retired SWO by designator who then went on to be an expeditionary anti-terrorism expeditionary warfare officer. Along the way, got some certifications in history and military planning, and that led me into this podcasting realm. So that's me, and with me today is Brian Sunshine Sinclair.
Hey, Roger. Thanks. Yeah, so I'm just a washed-up test pilot. So I flew in the Navy, did F-18s, S-3s, and then did Air Force test pilot school. So I got about 30 different types of planes under my belt. Did predominantly weapons testing, so that'd be weapon launching as well as weapon chasing, which is kind of fun. Wrapped up at about a little over 20 years. Also got to teach aerospace engineering at the Naval Academy. So I went there as a student and then flew a little bit, did Iraq and Afghanistan, and then went back as a teacher and then became a test pilot and worked in China Lake and San Diego for the remainder of my career. Currently, I have obviously retired, as mentioned earlier, and now I am advising for the Navy on certain systems.
All right. So I should say that with that, none of our discussion today represents the views of the United States Navy or the Department of Defense, just our experience as a couple of naval officers and trained observers who have worked in this realm before. So
Indeed.
why are we here today? Well, first of all, we're not here to place blame. We don't know everything that happened yet, and that's not what either of us intend to do. We're also not going to give you a definitive answer on what happened, but what we hope to do is analyze what information is out there right now and give you, our viewer, an opportunity to ask maybe more informed questions if this wasn't the life you led. I did 10 years on Aegis ships, one of them a cruiser just like the Gettysburg. Shine did multiple years of carrier aviation, including in Hornets and Rhinos, correct?
Correct.
So we're coming at this from both sides of the coin, if you will.
That we are, yeah. So where do you want to start, Roger?
Well, let's give everyone a brief recap of what happened the night in question, and we'll talk about the sources, and we'll talk about the confidence level on the sources and what that means to us. So, Shine, do you want to sort of start by discussing the terminology we're going to use, because there's really 3 planes and 2 ships involved, right? There's the plane that was shot down, there was the plane that was almost shot down, there was the 3rd plane in the stack behind them, there was the cruiser Gettysburg that was the ship that shot the missiles, and there's the carrier Truman that was where the planes had launched and landed from. But we're not going to use all those terms because it gets very wordy. So what are we going to call these guys?
Yeah, if you don't mind. So we'll get to the call signs, but I just want to set the stage a little bit, Roger, and that is keep in mind that the Truman Strike Group here with CAG 1, right, they showed up in the Red Sea on December 14th, and then 9 short days later, on December 22nd, they had this shoot down. So operations in the Red Sea is when I was out there with CAG 3 on the Eisenhower. It's very different. It's a different animal out there. The op tempo is very high. It is combat operations, and they're what they call one-ways, or they're drones coming at the carrier. So they not only have to protect the carrier with SM-2 missiles or air-to-air missiles off F-18s, but they're also conducting combat operations into Yemen. So this is a 24/7 kind of operation. So, and it's something that we really haven't, as a U.S. Navy, haven't trained to in quite a while. So keeping in mind kind of a novel concepts, if you will, that were basically, some of them were codified for CAG 3, and now CAG 1 is using them in the Red Sea. But then that, along with the high op tempo, with the continuous combat 24/7, if you will, operations, make it for a really difficult and stressful, I'll say, picture. Now, keeping that in mind, moving into the tankers, yes, or sorry, the aircraft call signs. So we'll be focusing on 3 aircraft. There's the one that was shot down. He was a 5-wet tanker, meaning he's got 4 gas tanks and a buddy store, if you will, which is a 5th gas tank that actually has the ability to transfer gas out of the aircraft via a hose and a drogue assembly. The drogue being kind of like a badminton shuttlecock, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so the tanker we're going to call Texaco, just a very generic mission term or aircraft tactical call sign. And then the first striker, so the tanker's first in the conga line to land. The next guy, so number 2, we'll call him Ripper, because he was from VFA 11, we believe. And then finally Dog, as in puking dogs from 143 or VFA 143. So in the conga line to land, we have our tanker first. We'll call him Texaco. Then the first DCA, defensive counter-air, DCA guy coming down will be Ripper, and he will be number 2 in the line, and then Dog will be number 3.
Okay, perfect. And I know there's people out there who are going to say, well, the plane shot down was the tanker, and he was from the Red Rippers too. We realize that. We're using these terms to keep some separation in everyone's minds as we're having this discussion. And then I'll just add that Gettysburg was serving as the air warfare commander. And we can have a separate discussion about that. But what that means is the ship herself was fulfilling 2 roles. She was the Gettysburg, which had its own responsibility for defense of herself and the sector assigned by the Battle Group Air Warfare Commander. But the Battle Group Air Warfare Commander was also the CO of the Gettysburg. So in this, I'm going to use 2 terms. There's going to be Alpha Whiskey. Alpha is generic for a battle group. That's not Truman's specific call sign. I wouldn't give it to you if I knew it. And Whiskey is for the Air Warfare Commander. So that role fulfilled on Gettysburg is going to be referred to as Alpha Whiskey. And things that we think the Gettysburg crew did as the Gettysburg, the ship, we'll just call Gettysburg.
Sounds good.
Make sense? All right.
Perfect. Clear as mud.
Yeah, clear as mud. So let's take a look at what happened that night. And I'll just start by saying there's not a lot of official data out there yet, as there shouldn't be, right? You and I have talked, Shine, that naval aviation in particular, the Navy in general, knows what to do when there's an investigation. And unfortunately or fortunately, there's a long history of investigating mishaps within the U.S. Navy, depending on how you want to look at that. We're to launch in based heavily on unofficial reports that are out there, but we're not repeating them because we believe that all of this is going to be part of the investigation.
Perfect. Yeah. So thanks, Roger, for that.
Yeah, no worries.
So basically stitching together some unofficial reports, as you said, which I love, and then also just my experience around the carrier. So to set up, we already talked about the high tempo, and traditionally we'll fly maybe twice. If you're, especially the tanker, if you're going up for 3 cycles or 3 different events sequentially, it can get very taxing. And it sounds like that's what happened with Texaco this night. So I guess VFA 11, right? They're going to launch. And they're going to launch as frontside tanking for the Strikers. Strikers being separate aircraft, they're going to launch probably only 5 minutes behind the tanker. So the tanker's going to start driving towards some point that's going to be on the strike route, but still in friendly waters, if you're friendly territory.
Airspace, yeah.
Yeah, airspace, thank you. So the tanker launches. He's going to provide frontside gas to basically top off the Strikers up at altitude. Then he's going to turn back and land on the carrier. He's going to do what we call a hot pit, if you will. So he's going to gas up again. So he's going to keep his engine turning, probably get full of gas, and he's going to launch again. And now he's going to provide a bunch of frontside tanking to the DCA players, the defensive counter-air. So now he's going to come back and land for a second time. So now he's completed 2 missions. And then at this point, he's sitting on deck. They're going to top him off again with gas, and they're going to launch him for a 3rd sortie, if you will. And that's when all this is going to kind of go down, if you will. So Stryker's going to return back to the carrier as best we can tell. And then from there, the DCA players are still airborne because they have to obviously provide some defensive nets, if you will, against any of the one-ways, as they're calling them nowadays, or the Houthi drones that are inbound to naval ships, right?
Right.
So a majority of the DCA package is actually going to recover, but then they have kind of the last of the Mohicans, the last guys to land. And at night, as you can imagine, it's a little different than during the day when it comes to recoveries, and they have something called the Marshal. So do you want to, Roger, should we dive into that for a little bit, the specifics of night landing?
Let me just really quickly, some things for people to think about, because we're going to come back to them later, is that Texaco now has had to launch and recover. Well, launch 3 times, obviously only recovered twice, but 3 turns there. There's a lot going on. There's inbound strikes, there's outbound strikers, there's outbound DCA or defensive counter air. So just to reiterate what Shine was saying earlier, a very, very high tempo, very high tension. I want to say chaotic because it's all controlled. The other thing that strikes me, I just want to ask the question really quickly, is in peacetime cyclic ops, I'm used to the tanker being next to the last or the last bird to recover. I'm presuming here that Texaco, the tanker, was recovering before those last 2 DCA because they didn't want to be in a situation where they had non-DCA aircraft airborne because they're in a combat scenario. Is that right?
Possibly, or what we don't know from the unofficial reports is if there's another tanker airborne. So
fair enough.
Traditionally, a mission tanker is going to be a different aircraft than the recovery tanker. So
okay,
so probably there's another aircraft that's 5 or 3 wet anyway that's overhead as the recovery tanker.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. So let's talk Marshall stack so people understand what that means, and we can start because I think it's very easy to go find a video of a daytime carrier recovery, and it's pretty easy to understand what happens there relatively. Just by the fact that it's at nighttime, there's no good video explaining what a nighttime or case 3 recovery is. So talk us through that, Sean.
You betcha. So the carrier will say it's moving due north, just for easy math here. So heading of 000. Now, traditionally, that would be also called the final bearing, whether it's offset maybe 10 degrees or so, but we're going to call that the initial reference. And then what will happen is there'll be a Marshall stack. So a Marshall stack is going to be an imaginary position in space and time, actually, behind the aircraft carrier, a certain distance and a certain altitude above. So it's kind of like the recovery or the approach, I say the approach corridor to a normal airport is going to be analogous to this case 3 recovery. We call it a CV1 approach, as in CV for carrier. And then the Marshall stack, there we go, is going to be the holding pattern that's behind, or the very beginning, if you will, of the CV1 approach.
Okay.
And so they'll traditionally say, hey, 401 Marshall Angel 6, push time, and they'll give a certain time for when you're actually going to commence your approach. So when I hear Angel 6, that means, okay, so I'm the lowest in the stack of altitudes for holding. And then I always know this, their standard math, Angel 6 means 6,000 feet. I'm going to add 15 to that, and that gives me my distance where I need my Marshall point to be, if you will. So so where I will commence my approach. So obviously public math here, 6 plus 15 is 21. So I'm going to be basically doing a racetrack pattern left-hand turns where when I hit a certain radial, the Marshall radial, at 21 DME, I'm going to start a left-hand turn, and that'll be the part of my racetrack at 6,000 feet.
Got it. So planes are coming in and stacking up, starting at the first one at 6,000 feet, 21 miles, and then there's an even spacing back and up from that for every other plane in that recovery cycle.
Yeah, exactly right. So a guy at 6,000, a guy at 7,000, obviously 7 plus 15 is 22, so he's staggered a little aft too. His Marshall point will be at 22 nautical miles. The next guy will be at 23, and so on and so forth. So
right.
Yeah, you got it. So now let me ask you this, Roger, as let's role play. Let's say you're on the Gettysburg.
Yeah.
So you're air warfare commander. You're going to see the Marshall stack, whether they're squawking or not, whether they have their modes and codes working. You're going to see a bunch of radar returns in a certain area, correct?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So you'll see these radar returns. You know where you are. You know where Mom is. So you can pretty much divine the final bearing, right, or the approach. Mm-hmm. So that whole area. Now, CV NATOPS, our instruction manual for how to land on the boat, especially at night here we're referencing, gives a kind of a safe corridor. It's so many degrees or radials off of the final bearing, if you will. So I think it's 30 to 10, if you will. But anyway, so point being is there's this safe space corridor. And now how would you say the air warfare commander, how can they pick out good guys versus bad guys just from geometry alone? Yeah,
so what the Air Warfare Alpha Whiskey or any of the air defense ships are going to do is there's going to be a sequence of things they do to try and identify inbound contacts. And to your point, if these guys are, we haven't mentioned it yet, but these guys are fenced out, right? Which means they've turned off all their combat mission gear, their radar, their raw gear or radar warning receivers, their chaff and flare dispensers are usually off, correct?
They are, and if you don't mind,
Yeah.
so when
Yeah.
I fence out, I quite literally am taking off my combat hat and I'm putting on my landing hat. So not only are we turning off our defensive systems, to your point, which is spot on, but also my mindset has shifted from I'm not worried about threats necessarily outside. I'm more worried about just trying to land
Yeah.
safely on the aircraft carrier.
What did the old study show? That they wired up pilots in Vietnam, and landing on the carrier at night was more stressful than actually flying strikes over Hanoi. So
Totally get it.
take that for what it's worth. So
Yeah.
with all of this, what this means now, critically, their IFF or identification friend or foe should have been working. We'll talk about that in a second. But to answer your question directly, what is that air warfare ship or Alpha Whiskey doing to identify these guys? Well, they're going to look for any electronic emissions, right? So the APG 73, or I think they're all 79 now, probably on
Correct,
the Rhinos.
probably. Yeah, ASA.
So you're looking for that to break out a radar contact. You're looking for the IFF. You're looking for a link track, which means maybe somebody else has already seen this and identified the track and has put what we call friendly symbology on it. Or someone named Red Crown, which is a watch position within a strike group that is responsible for delousing incoming aircraft, which means make sure what's coming back to the carrier is friendly and that there's no hostile tracking right in behind them. We sort of learned that lesson over the course of World War II, that we needed that.
Indeed.
Those are all the things that the air warfare commander is going to look for. In addition, if you're coming back from a strike, there may or may not be, I've seen it used and I've seen it not used, return to force corridors. And I don't, if you want to talk about those, Shine, or if we want to be very generic about those, I would understand why.
Oh, sure, we can. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's just friendly fire, bad, obviously. So high
Yes.
risk of that, especially when we have a bunch of drones inbound to the strike group, we'll say. So RTF procedures are huge. So 3 different mitigations, I would say, to make sure that we don't shoot down our own guys. One is going to be Link 16. So it's like a giant Wi-Fi network. Ideally, the ships and the aircraft are all dialed in, we'll call it tuned into this Wi-Fi network. And in the said Wi-Fi network, the entities, the ships and the planes and all that, have little electronic green flags, we'll say, saying, hey, this is me, don't shoot me down. So identification. If Link 16 or the Wi-Fi were not to work, then we do have our we call it mode 5 now, our IFF for interrogator, or identify, friends or foe. So ideally, one of those 2 electronic mitigation would work. And if not, and in addition to, we will fly these RTF, or return to force profiles, which is a specific 3D highway in the sky. So it's an altitude and airspeed, as well as a heading that you should fly to basically be in a safe corridor to get back to the carrier. And that's further out than the Marshall stack. So
Right.
if you think of the carrier as the center of the circle, we'll call it, and then the Marshall stack out to, say, 30 to 40 miles or so behind Mom or the carrier, the RTF stuff is usually much further out, say like 50 to 150 nautical miles from Mom.
Right. So everything that's happening is happening inside that area where we'd have kinetic opportunity for the aircraft to identify themselves.
Absolutely.
They're down on all of the active emitters except for that IFF that would have identified them. So that starts to play into what might have been seen here. And I don't know for the Rhino, but I know back in the day when the Tomcat was still active, there was a lively discussion between the air defense guys and the air wing guys about how close would it be okay for defensive counter air to be to an inbound threat for the Aegis to shoot. And Aegis's position was always, well, as long as you're 500 or 600 feet away, we're fine, because the system is supposed to not. You're right. That's exactly what they said, and this is bravely said from the guy in the CIC, not in the plane.
Yeah.
But we said, absolute closest, because our missile will not home. We cannot target something that has a positive at the time mode 4, now mode 5, IFF, and I remember the Tomcat guys going, "That's super, but it's a known problem that our IFF antenna is between those twin tails on the old Tomcat, right? And depending on your aspect, you may not get a return from that right away." And that sort of totally changed the equation in the conversation about what would be a clear enough target for us to shoot on. There was a little bit of, shall we say, putting things on the table and measuring them in this case, when we were like, "Oh, we'll do it at 500 or 600 feet." I mean, realistically, we would have done it further away than that, but I think everyone was trying to show the degree of accuracy. So I tell all that to say, I don't know if the Rhino has any considerations there, or if they've, in the intervening, 25 to 30 years of design evolution between the Tomcat and the Rhino, managed to get true 360 degree in both azimuth and elevation coverage for that antenna.
They're a lot better. So for the Rhino or the Super Hornet, right, we have the APX 111. So that is our combined interrogator transponder, or we just call it CIT. And the CIT antennas predominantly are what I call or colloquially, I guess, called they're under the pizza box,
right,
which is going to be forward of the windscreen, if you will. So basically on top of the nose is the primary placement of those antennas. So it does provide a much greater field of visibility, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and that especially for an inbound target. Okay, so that's what the Gettysburg and Alpha Whiskey would be seeing and would be looking for.
Yeah, and I think it's huge to mention, though, that if these guys are up Link 16, right, that Wi-Fi of which you spoke earlier, and their CIT is working, then it's, at least for me, and question for you later in a second here, and that is, I worry about correlation. So correlation to me is two data sources, and then I want to make sure that they map and they correlate, if you will, to the same spot or location in kind of 3D or maybe even 4D, so add time in there. So to me, if a guy's got Link 16, we call it sweet. So if he's a sweet timber, so he's connected to the Wi-Fi network, and he's got his CIT working, I find it so now you have two sources of, hey, I'm a friendly guy information, and they're mapped to the same geo-reference, if you will. I'm having a hard time understanding where the issues would lie, especially because they're on a published approach to the carrier.
Right. So now I have a thought, and we can come to that later after we talk about the recap of what happened. Yeah. Quick question about that: when you fence out, are you coming down on your participation in the link as well, or do you stay active in the link?
Stay active in the link, yeah. Stay active in the link, and my CIT is not turned off either.
Right. Okay.
That's one of those weight off wheels stays on. Okay.
When we get to this sort of analysis of what might have happened, we should probably delve into a open source unclassed level of how Link works, because the more we're discussing this, the more a possibility is building in my mind. Okay. So in any case, we've got Texaco, Ripper, and Dog on a funnel, if you will, into that final bearing to the carrier, right? And that's when everything starts to transpire.
Correct, yeah. And so they're coming down the chute. Remember, they're up at a martial altitude, and they're stacked probably 5 miles behind each other. So there's 5 miles of separation between Texaco and Ripper, and then another 5 miles between Ripper and Dog. And they're all basically flying the same heading toward the carrier, and they're descending at relatively the same profile, coming down to until they're about 10 miles. And then this is all unclassed. At 10 miles, they should be at 1,200 feet and level. That is just part of the published procedure for recovering aboard the aircraft carrier. And so at that point, once again, I've got my landing hat on, and it's a night landing. So I'm uber focused, we'll say, on landing on the boat, not thinking about any kind of air-to-air or surface-to-air threats at that point, right? So now the unofficial reports show that the gentlemen, actually, those three planes of which we speak, they see each other because it's at night. They have lights on. Oh, by the way, when you fence out, Roger, you take off your night vision goggles.
Right.
So traditionally, the SOP, our requirements, if you will, say, hey, you got to take off your goggles X amount of minutes prior to landing so that your eyes can adjust, right? So I think that's going to play a critical role in their missile as they visually track the missile inbound to themselves, and that is for the Texaco flight. So they fenced out, goggles off. They're on the CV-1, right? So they're coming down. They're probably at 1,200 feet or about close there. usually descending at 3. You're supposed to be at 250 knots. These guys might have been a little fast coming down the hill, whatever. But eventually they're going to approach 6 miles where they want to dirty up. So they're going to drop their landing gear and their flaps and slow down. So they're on a very defined profile. And right as they're, I believe, leveling off, it sounds like they're going to lock off to their right side about 2:30, 3 o'clock. They're going to see a missile launch. And the air crew, now we're talking specific to the Texaco crew, they're going to say, oh, wow, check that out. They're launching a missile to probably intercept a drone, right, or a one-way. They're not thinking, oh, they're launching a missile at us. So fortunately, they have their night vision goggles off. What that does is it provides a lot of peripheral cues, if you will. So you're not looking through the soda straws anymore. You got your normal unaided eyesight, which is great for periphery, but you can't obviously distinguish specific shapes at night, if you will. So anyway, but the SM-2, and I've seen an SM-2 launch during the day, not at night, but during the day it was quite bright. So at night, I'm assuming it's going to light up the sky. Have you ever seen an SM-2 launch?
I have, and if you see, we see a lot of video Tomahawk night launches. An SM-2 is so much brighter than a Tomahawk, right? The Tomahawk is boosting out, and it's going to transition to a subsonic cruise. The SM-2 is basically, I don't want to use the term pit bull because that has a very specific meaning for you guys in aviation with a missile. But it's a pit bull of a weapon. It has one function in life, which is, oh, I got taken off the leash. I need to accelerate right now. The thing has broken the sound barrier before it's out of the VLS launcher.
Nice.
And it is going hell-bent for leather to go find its target right now, because its original purpose was to get as far away from the ship as possible to intercept an inbound. Well, not just because you want to intercept a inbound Soviet-designed supersonic missile as quickly as possible.
Oh, understood. Okay.
Yeah, so it is like a rocket launch. It's probably not as bright as the Saturn rockets going to the moon, but it is super bright.
It's a beast. Yeah, and those things unclassed, it looks like they can engage targets up to 65,000 feet going the missile going Mach 3 or greater. So yeah, I could see I call it a mad. Yeah, we don't use pit bull. You're right. So I just call it a mad dog, if you will. So unleash the mad dog. Boom.
It's a honey badger. How's that?
There you go.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Unleash the honey badger. Very bright at night. So obviously it gains the air crew's attention for probably both, or I should say all 3 aircraft coming and land. Like, whoa, that's kind of cool. So I think if I were to role play a little bit here, so I'm the tanker, I'm worried about landing on the boat, and I see this missile launch, and I'm thinking, wow, dude, I bet they're shooting down other drones. There's got to be a drone around here somewhere close. And I was like, oh, that's cool. Go get them, So you're kind of, get out the popcorn and love to watch this intercept, right? So they're watching this thing track up, if you will. And then apparently as it apexes, or it kind of reaches the apogee or the top of its trajectory, it starts to arc toward them.
Right.
And we have some good training that goes on that shows during the day, we call them Smoky Sams because it's easier to see than a dot. But basically, the exhaust of some of the surface-to-air missiles is very dirty, so it has a lot of smoke, and we use that to our advantage to be able to visually track missiles. Well, at night, you're not going to see smoke, but you will see the bright plume of the rocket motor. And so kind of analogous to the Smoky Sam during the day is going to be the bright missile at night. So we've been trained on what to look for if a missile is coming at us, if it's going to pull lead or pull pure pursuit, we call it, basically trying to consummate an intercept. And these guys, I think, or at least I would, let's do a little role play again. I'm sitting in the tanker there, looking over. I'm cheering this guy on as the missile, that is, cheering the missile on as it's going to go, I hopefully hit a drone. And then all of a sudden I see it turn toward me. And my guess is I would have about 3, maybe 5 seconds at the most, because this thing is traveling Mach 3 plus, to decide if I'm going to stay with the jet or not. Oh, by the way, I'm slowing down to probably gear speed, right? 250 knots or so. I'm down at 1,200 feet, so I'm low and slow, so I'm out of options when it comes to missile defense. And oh, by the way, I shut off my defensive systems when I fenced out. Yeah. So I really feel that I really feel that I probably would have ejected too. I'd say it's a miracle that these guys ejected prior to impact, which is fantastic. The way I understand the mech of this weapon is it's a hit to kill weapon. So it's not going to blow up in the vicinity of the aircraft. It's going to hit the aircraft. And when you're 1,500 pounds with an explosive going Mach 3 plus, And if I don't see if they had stayed in the aircraft for impact, I don't see them as probably living. So I'm glad they ejected prior to impact.
Yeah, you're spot on. The SM2 family, right? I guess theoretically this could have been an SM6. A couple things to note, and a couple things that very glad that the guys made it out alive. Testament to the training and everything you just described. One facet of the SM2 family is it was never originally designed to attack a sea skimming cruise missile, right? That's not what the Soviets were building when we designed the SM2.
Okay.
And if anyone's interested, you can go back to the Authentic channel, and Shine and I did a whole episode on the SM2 family. But for purposes of this discussion, the pure kinematics of the SM2 launching to get that speed and altitude are that even when it's going after a sea skimming target, it climbs to a probably still classified, but I feel safe saying 5-figure foot. So right, 10,000-ish feet altitude just through physics before it can wrench itself down around to come back down and attack a sea skimming target. So that's the apex you were talking about, and I'm glad it was that and not something like, say, a vertical launch Sea Sparrow that could turn on a dime as it comes out of the launcher and maybe give these guys a little less time. The other thing is you're absolutely right. The SM-2 is a hit-to-kill missile. It does have a warhead, right? It's not like the Ram, which is a literal solid body that has to hit. It does have a directional blast fragmentation warhead, which means that it will actually sense the radar return from itself against the target and expend all of its shrapnel and explosive force in direction of the target. But in point of fact, even from the inception of Aegis in the 80s, it was fairly routine to do training missile shoots with a telemetry missile that was designed to miss the target drone so it could be reused. And the system would not even allow itself to be tricked by the offset. It was fairly common to skin, as we called it, the target drone that we were trying to save, because Aegis fights every erg of energy that would make it miss its target.
Totally get it. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so also relative distance is probably important to talk about here. So we've got Mom, or the carrier, we'll call kind of center of the action. And then the unofficial reports are stating that it was the Gettysburg is about 10 miles aft of the carrier.
Right.
And then these guys are obviously after the carrier also on their approach. And remember, they should be level at 10 miles aft behind Mom. So they're in the vicinity, I'm going to say probably within 5 or so miles of the Gettysburg is the targeted aircraft.
Yeah.
So this is a very quick evolution from, wow, there goes a rocket going to shoot down a drone, great, to, oh no, it's coming at me, to I'm in the water and wet, right?
Yeah.
So golly, maybe, I don't know, 5 to 15 seconds at the most.
Something like that. Yeah, I'm trying to figure. So you said the first Marshall point is how far back?
6 plus 15, 21 miles.
21 miles. So if they were coming to the first Marshall stack, they're between 5 and 10 miles from Gettysburg. That unofficially we're hearing is 10 miles behind the carrier.
Yeah, and so keep that in mind, that CV1 approach with the marshalling points of which we spoke earlier, that's a plan from which to deviate.
Sure.
Now, because this might have been a flex deck operations where they're not doing normal cyclic ops because of the combat ops, I don't know, but it sure sounds like they're definitely on final bearing or pretty darn close to it. So they're probably 10 to 15 miles behind Mom, or the carrier, and then Gettysburg being 10 miles. So that's how I kind of divide my math. They're probably about 5 miles away from the missile launch.
Not very far. Not a lot of reaction time, and a tribute to the training they got in their decision making. In all of this, we'll see what the report says when it comes out. I would anticipate at least a year before this thing's done and someone issues a FOIA and so on and so forth. I would be very hard pressed to see a scenario where the crew was criticized at all for their ejection decision.
I agree, and I'm hoping honestly that it's not human error on either the aircraft or the ship side.
Right.
And I could see it being some kind of an electronic hiccup, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and we'll take a look at that here in a minute. So that's Texaco, right? Texaco now, they've punched out and you can read in other sources what their experiences in the water. But now we've got Ripper, right, which was the lead in the two, we presume, the two-plane DCA that's coming back with the Ripper and the dog.
Yeah, he's got front row seating basically to this whole thing going down. He's probably co-altitude or shortly or almost at altitude with the Texaco that just blew up, if you will. And he's probably about 5 miles aft. They usually sequence the aircraft about 5 mile separation, as mentioned earlier. So he is going to go through the same group of emotions, I would say, slightly different though, and that he's going to see a missile launch thinking, oh, cool, they're going to go shoot down a drone coming at the carrier, or, some of us here. And then all of a sudden he sees an explosion of his buddy in front of him. And then he sees a second missile launch out of the Gettysburg.
Right. So
that's where I would have, if I were eating my popcorn, I would have dropped it, gotten big, wide-eyed, and be like, what the? And I think he does the same thing. So now he's thinking, okay, this second missile is probably not going after a drone, but it's probably coming after me.
Right.
So what do I need to do? Oh, by the way, I have my landing hat on. I have my night vision goggles off. I've fenced out, so my defensive systems are turned off. So the best thing I think I would try to do at the time would probably be left hand full forward, so throttle to afterburner if my landing gear is not deployed and flaps. And then I would dip down to get low and fast as quickly as possible to get some energy on the jet. So then we can ideally use that to maneuver and evade the missile.
Right.
Now the reports are showing that the second missile, it was bright as the first one. Now the first one, the rocket motor was engaged all the way to impact, apparently, of the aircraft. The second missile, the motor, the source light, I guess, from the motor anyway, disappeared. So I don't know if the weapon was aborted, perhaps, or what happened, but the missile went dark. The Ripper, in our case, is going to maneuver down low, doing some classified tactics, if you will. But keep in mind, Roger, we don't train missile defense against our own missiles. We train against missile defense for the bad guy missiles. So he's probably thinking like, wow, or what I would be thinking is, wow, well, I'm going to pretend this is a bad guy missile. I don't really know how the good guys work and how to defend against it. Didn't read a chapter on that. So anyway, he's going to maneuver. And there are, once again, unofficial reports that the missile passed an estimate from, I believe, the aircrew or somebody in the vicinity there, that the missile passed the aircraft by about 100 feet, splashed in the water. And then from there, obviously the Ripper and the dog aircrew stayed in their aircraft, if you will.
Right. Now, it's interesting to me as we talk through that, it's funny, maybe the Navy needs a little more just cross-pollination, right? Because knowing the little bit I know about how you guys evade, and I won't give away any classified information, but it sounds like what the Ripper crew did was exactly the right thing against how an SM-2 guides. And again, I don't want to get into the details of that.
Sure.
But yeah, that transition from a higher altitude to a lower altitude close into the carrier with that angle is, no chaff, no flares, no jammer, pure maneuver. I'm going to guess it was pure maneuver on the Ripper's part that led to their survival. The reason I'm saying that is an SM-2, when you abort the SM-2, it doesn't go stupid, it explodes. And the idea is you don't want a big dumb body out there flying around somewhere to just, what do you guys call it? Big sky, little airplane, but just even a dead stick hit with this missile would be devastating. So if it actually did hit the water without exploding, my guess is it was attempting to guide and had lost the Ripper aircraft. As far as the booster burning out, I'm not sure if when the missile is nose on, if you would lose the burner or not, because it's not. I'd have to think about how quickly. I guess the booster may burn out that quickly, because normally after we saw it launch from the ship or from another ship near us, I'd say after the first 5 or 10 seconds, I imagine you might be able to look up what the burn is. It might be classified. You're following the smoke trail. You're not following the booster glow anymore. So that's possible. It could have expended all of its boost already. But in any case, unless something's changed and they allow missiles to just go dead, or they command them into the water now somehow, which would be a little strange to me. Self-destruct, and I was part of a you and I talked about it before. I was part of an incident where we had to self-destruct a missile to avoid a peacetime blue on blue, and it was a literal self-destruction. The other thing, I was part of a scenario where the ship next to us was shooting, and we had a camera crew on board, so we were up really tight against her, and her missile never established uplink out of the launcher, and the missile self-destructed. Right,
Wow.
so like right over the head of both ships, you've got shrapnel raining down. No one was hurt, but it just, again, unless something major has changed, these missiles self-destruct when you go to abort. They don't just go stupid into the water.
Ah, good to know. Did not realize
Yeah.
that. Different than our abort mechanics for our test missiles that I used to fly. So
Yeah.
gotcha. So then I'll tell you what, let's chalk that one up to miracle number 2. That
Yep.
would be that the Ripper didn't get shot down, given he's, so all he's got available is left hand in the corner, we call it, or throttle all the way forward, and then trade altitude for whatever he has, the airspeed, and then maneuver against. So
Yeah.
good on him.
So,
At that po-
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, at that point, now, so, and also Paddles has another almost front row, the opposite side, right, of the arena, we'll call it, for this whole thing. So Paddles sees the SM-2 launch, sees his 3 aircraft as they're on final bearing, probably, because Paddles, the landing signals officer, or LSO, is looking aft, and he's probably, not a lot of lights out there, so he can see the twinklies, if you will, of his 3 lights, and then, 3 aircraft that are going to recover. He sees the missile, he sees the missile impact, and then probably sees the second launch, but then I would assume if I were Paddles at that point, I would be screaming up to tower. So in other words, I'd be on a separate phone talking to the air control tower in the aircraft carrier and saying, hey, we're shooting our own guys. So I'm assuming there's a bat phone or a red phone or some way that the aircraft carrier can immediately communicate with all CSG ships. Does that sound right, Roger?
It does, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so then I could see whoever's the watch captain or whoever's the senior guy on the deck grabs the bat phone or the red phone and calls and tells all of his units to stand down, if you will.
Ceasefire, ceasefire. Yeah, which,
Ceasefire, there you go.
I mean, that alone is, let's talk about this string of miracles or good fortune or good training or, usually good fortune and good training combined to create miracles sometimes. You're in the middle of a night where you've been launching strikes at somebody who is shooting back at you. That's sort of a gutsy call to call ceasefire to the entire strike group. You know what I mean?
agree.
That's a gutsy call.
It is, man. But when you just saw what you saw, I don't know what, maybe there's, I don't know what the other, a lot of combat communications are very scripted, right? And they have to be because of the tempo of the operations, if you will. I'm very comfortable with scripted comms, and if we go off the script, we call it trucker comm, right? And I'm not sure if the captain would have used some kind of trucker comm, say, hey guys, we're shooting ourselves, be real careful, or if they just said ceasefire, I have no idea.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I can tell you if I was sitting in Gettysburg CIC as either the Gettysburg TAO or the Alpha Whiskey TAO, we'd call it a red phone, meaning an encrypted circuit.
Okay, sure.
If I got an encrypted circuit call that said blue on blue ceasefire, there's not a question in my mind, right? I'm probably turning the keys to safe, which is that quick. I'm going to reach down to my left. I'm going to turn the key about, 25 degrees left, and no missile is leaving my ship, no matter what button gets pushed. So I can see that. And I will say it's going to be interesting to see if the dog aircraft was going to be targeted next, and if that call saved a launch at that aircraft.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Before we move on to something else, the unofficial reports also mentioned that Rhino's first indication, at least as I read it, that there was a problem was the ELTs. Do I have that term right? The ELT from the seats after the Texaco crew ejected?
Yeah, the emergency locator transponder. So, or transmitter, maybe. Sorry about that. Yeah. So to me, as aircrew still in an aircraft, when I hear an ELT go off, it's quite literally a blazing radio signal that comes into the cockpit and it's going to overwhelm any voice communication. So it basically is a giant beacon, if you will, of sound. And I'm sure that everyone heard the ELT go off. Everyone who's on a radio at the time, so whether it be on a ship or in an aircraft that's flying, obviously,
right,
you're going to hear the ELT go off.
I've heard training tapes, and I've heard older ones, and there's this really loud peer, 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 peer. Is that still the sound
exactly
they make?
It.
Yeah.
Yep. That's it. And it's usually an annoyance thing because it's there's a maintenance practice where they're disconnecting a circuit and then reconnecting it on a plane that's on the ground.
Right.
And unfortunately, sometimes they disconnect the circuit while the aircraft's still powered, and then the ELT goes off, and it literally crushes communication on that frequency, or really, actually on all frequencies, excuse me, because it's a guard. It's a guard.
Ships have something similar. God, it's been a long time. EPIRB maybe, and same thing. Every once in a while, a ship's doing maintenance, and all of a sudden, your whole strike group or anyone actually within range of radio comms is like, "Oh my God, is someone sinking? Did someone just have a?" So I get it. The reason I bring it up is that is one of those sounds that, for me as a SWO, the general quarters gong is still a bit of a heart-pounding Pavlovian bell, if you will, right?
I totally get it. Yep.
I know for you guys it's movie time, friendly camaraderie here. But for me, it still gets the pulse going, and I'm wondering if the fact that that's the first thing the Ripper heard just instantaneously reset his brain to some extent from landing mode to that glare's he had to be in that mindset that next glow is coming at me.
I would think, and then ideally, and I don't know how many seconds the gentleman in Ripper aircraft had to process this, and I'm sure they're a lot faster than I am these days, but that is also an indication, ideally they heard the ELT before they saw the missile impact. So to me, that would mean, my buddy's ejected out of the plane.
Right. And so that's how I read that as well. And I read it as 4 or 5 seconds later, the Gettysburg fired her second missile. And we can talk about that in analysis of what happened, because the fact that it was 4 or 5 seconds after impact tells me some things about what probably was going on in Gettysburg as a SWO, the things it tells me.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, I think so. We talked. Oh,
go ahead.
I was going to say, we talked about the aircraft. We talked about the air crew for landing. We talked about paddles a little bit, right? The LSOs who are looking aft on the carrier. We talked a little about tower. I think all they have to know is that, they're watching, and actually CATSI too. So there's an air traffic control station nestled in the deep within the carrier that's going to obviously know visual references, right? So they're going to be using radar returns to traffic manage, we'll say, around the aircraft carrier. So CATSI's probably watching what's going on. The tower may have a lookout, but they're not really doing much except steering the ship, right? And then paddles. So I feel from the aviation side, I think we've stepped through all the scenarios, or the perspectives, I guess, of the scenario.
Yeah.
So do you want to delve into the Gettysburg SWO side?
Yeah, let's look at that a little bit. One thing I'll say that is a sort of a nice transition there, a segue, is my understanding of carrier ops as a guy who sat on the air defense ships is there's essentially a 10-mile bubble around the carrier that is the carrier's air traffic control domain. Is that accurate for you guys from the aviation perspective?
That distance is going to vary basically between day and night, and then also tactical versus kind of administrative assumptions. So I'm going to keep the numbers out of it. But when I check in the strike, who's going to be the big picture guy, I'm much further out than 10 miles. But you're right. The traffic within 10 miles of MOM or the carrier is very micromanaged on the radar. How about that?
Yeah, that's a fair way to put it, because from the SWO perspective, from the ship perspective, that bubble, I'm not driving my controlled cap stations through it. I'm not doing anything in there.
Good call.
And to me, as my mindset, that bubble is like, I don't even think about things in that bubble, right? Because by the time it's 10 miles from the carrier, it's the carrier's problem. And keep in mind, I'm saying that as an Aegis guy, and think of Aegis as the Secret Service to the carrier being the president. Like, our entire reason for being is to make sure that guy doesn't get shot. So to say I don't care about what happens inside that 10 miles is a little disingenuous. It's a little flippant of me to say, But what it really means is I better, like, there's so much going on with aircraft within that 10 miles. I'm expecting the carrier's own ship weapons to be what's dealing with her defense in there, which means I better have dealt with the problem well before the 10 miles. So that is now, let's take that in the Gettysburg and the Alpha Whiskey mindset, right? So let's step back and talk about Alpha Whiskey. Alpha Whiskey, that air defense commander, is going to be controlling all the air defense assets in the strike group tactically. We don't generate them. We don't say who they're going to be. We don't necessarily say how many cap stations they're going to be, though in the planning phase they will. But as far as a watchstander, your job is to take the resources that are given to you and put them in the places the plan says, right? The cap stations, the aircraft, or the ships in their sectors. The E2, which is this neat sort of hybrid, it's an aircraft, but the Alpha Whiskey treats it like a ship because it's going to control its own cap stations. So Alpha Whiskey is going to guide all these various pieces, and they're each going to have a sector, right? So, one ship's going to have the sector from north at 000. I'm going to make up a number, but clockwise to 045. Then another ship's going to have 045 to 090. And then maybe the E2s, you get it, around the clock, right? Or around the threat sector.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I think it's a good point. Thanks for bringing up the E2. I forgot about that. So I forgot that airborne perspective. But the E2 is actually going to call, his systems aren't working right, and he's going to hand off control to one of the ships. Yeah,
let's hold off on that for a second, because I want to put that in context of what Alpha Whiskey and Gettysburg are seeing.
Sure, okay.
So you've got that, and each of those is going to have a sector for their own missiles to defend. If they have a cap station assigned, there's actually going to be a air intercept controller on the ship who's controlling that cap station, just like there is in the E2. What controlling a cap station means is you are the ground controlled intercept, if you will, even though E2 it's airborne controlled intercept, right? If we're being pedantic, you're going to vector your guys onto what is seen by your ship and Alpha Whiskey as the biggest threat for that cap station. Go out there to take a look at it, go out there to intercept it, so on and so forth.
Sure.
All this is happening in a comms architecture, and I've had people look at me and go, how can you not just talk to all the planes and say we're about to launch missiles? Well, it doesn't work that way, right? So there is guard, right? There is the common frequency of guard that anyone can pick up the handset on a ship or a plane or anywhere, a civilian, and anyone's going to hear that transmission. But you don't work on that tactically because anyone can hear it.
Correct.
So what's probably happening at this point is Alpha Whiskey has been controlling the defense of the strike group all night, right? He's been working with Red Crown to make sure that all the returning strikers are deloused, to make sure that we're deconflicting those guys from inbound one-ways, as you said. And I have definitely seen unofficial reports that there were one-ways. I've seen reports that I'll give just marginally less credibility to, but I still think they're true, that there were anti-ship cruise missiles as well. But in any case, there's a one-way threat coming into the strike group, and that's important because when you talk about their one-ways, those things range anywhere in speed from about 120 miles an hour up to 300, 350. The Iranians are now making a Shaheed variant that uses a turbojet. I don't think it's a turbofan, but they're up to 350 knots, which now really factors into this for me. Now, so Alpha Whiskey's looking at all this, but he's looking at this macro, right? He's like, I'm looking at the whole big picture. And who is Alpha Whiskey? Actually, the watchstander, he's probably one of the two senior department heads on Gettysburg, right? So an Aegis ship has the structure of a ship is going to be the commanding officer, the executive officer. Those two guys or girls generally don't stand watch. They're there whenever there's a problem, whenever they need to be. The people standing watch are department heads. So you're talking about guys or girls who have done probably 2 sea tours and a shore tour. They've gone to department head school. Their day job is either as the combat systems officer who owns the Aegis combat system, the weapons officer who fleets up to be the combat systems officer. He or she owns the weapons literally, right? And so those two things sort of work hand in hand.
So how many years? Sorry, how many years experience? I get sea tours, but for the folks at home,
10-ish.
10-ish.
10-ish. And, recruiting and retention means that I've seen department heads with as few as 6 or 7 years. You might be on your second tour, especially on a cruiser, which means you might have 12 or 13 years. But we're somewhere average, we're going to say the 9 to 12 years in the Navy.
Okay.
And you've probably been, this is probably your third ship, and you've probably seen at least 2 deployments.
So it's not your first rodeo.
It's not your first rodeo, and there's a whole discussion of how surface warfare works and how this very well could have been your first Aegis deployment. It could have been your first time on a ship that was Alpha Whiskey. It becomes very convoluted. But the key thing is, there's an operations officer who owns, we can get into all that probably in a different show, but there's the third guy. You have a chief engineer who's a department head. In my experience, the chief engineer is going to be down in engineering. He's not going to be standing TAO watches, which means you really have 3 department heads to stand tactical action officer or TAO on your ship. So now what do you do if you have to stand the force TAO or Alpha Whiskey watch and the ship's TAO? Well, generally you're pulling up a very savvy, very smart second tour division officer to maybe be the ship's TAO. Okay. Generally what we call the fire control officer. He's the second tour divo, so he's done a couple years on his first ship. He's gone to Aegis school, and then he's on the ship, and he owns the guys and the systems who make Aegis work. In my experience, that was how you broke that down, and now you're standing port and starboard watches, right? You got the 2 senior guys standing Alpha Whiskey, and you got the 2 junior guys who are the ship's TAO. Within that paradigm, we don't know if Alpha Whiskey told Gettysburg, and I know that's confusing to people who are going, well, wait a minute, they're all the same people. Well, they're not. Understand that it's not the same. You're on the same ship, but consider it a flagship now for Alpha Whiskey, just because you happen to be the same crew. We don't know if Alpha Whiskey gave Gettysburg direction to fire on these, or if Gettysburg saw a threat in their sector and decided time was short, and hold a thought there on why time may have been short at this distance from the carrier. And what's critical is that surface Navy, and you can tell me if aviation's any different, but I know it's different from the way the Army and the Air Force work. The Navy works on something called command by negation. Are you familiar with that?
Yep. Absolutely.
Same. Right.
Don't
so what is that?
micromanage.
Yeah. What that means is command by negation. If Shine is my boss, under command by negation, I'm going to say, Shine, I'm going to shoot track 1, 2, 3, 4. And if Shine doesn't say anything, he doesn't have to say yes. If I just don't hear him say anything, then I'm going to shoot that track. Whereas direct command would be, hey, Shine, I want to shoot track 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're going to say, go ahead and do it.
Absolutely, yeah. So the onus, but the onus is still with the commander, right? So the guy who pulls the trigger. Yeah, so, but the commander will acquiesce or speak only by exception, right, if you will.
Right.
Or by negation in this case.
Right. So what does all this start adding up to? It adds up to the fact that if there was any comms confusion, if anyone was stepping on anyone else, which is like Shine and I have done it right here, and we've been broadcasting things together for several years now, right? And we still step on each other from time to time.
Indeed.
That's going to cancel out the transmissions and I'm presuming Gettysburg took this shot not on Alpha Whiskey's direction, but regardless, Gettysburg could easily have perceived a threat, said Alpha Whiskey, I'm taking track, whatever equated to Texaco. Alpha Whiskey doesn't hear it. Alpha Whiskey doesn't get a chance to respond. The transmission to Alpha Whiskey is stepped on. The transmission back from Alpha Whiskey is stepped on. Any of these things can happen, and now Gettysburg is, I don't want to say absolved of responsibility, but she's still acting within the realm of acceptable behavior because the CO of a ship has what's called the inherent obligation of self-defense. You guys have that in aircraft too, right?
Similar, we do.
Yeah. So for guys who are following Second Amendment political issues in the United States. And I don't mean to get political here, but this is something that I think everyone in America has heard, right? The Castle Doctrine and the argument over, do you have the right to defend yourself? Do you have the right to defend your home? Mm-hmm. Set that aside, because you're talking about rights. Would I be covered under the law to shoot somebody? The inherent obligation of self-defense means I am obligated to defend my ship and whatever ship I'm protecting. And if I fail to do so, I am now culpable. I have committed a dereliction of duty. It's an important mindset to remember for that person on Gettysburg who's making the shoot, don't shoot decision. You're not just going, do I have the right to fire? You're asking, do I have the right to not fire on a threat to the ship? So that's an important distinction. I'll take a pause there on what was a long soliloquy to let you ask questions if you have any before I move to what I see happening next.
Thanks, Roger. Yeah, so you bring up a good point that I failed to think about until right now, and that is, so if there's a question, so if there's an inbound bogey, right, so not declared hostile or a bandit, just something flying at the carrier, so, and it could be, because it's unidentified, it could be a friendly. So if I launch a missile, I perhaps am preventing the carrier from being attacked or damaged, and then the cost is going to be that I lose one aircraft. So unfortunately, when I flew in Iraq and Afghanistan, it became an emotionless transactional kind of mindset, if you will. Combat did. So you're looking at something's going to be lost. Would you rather lose a single aircraft, or would you rather lose part of the carrier with multiple aircraft? So that tends to drive the decision of, well, if I don't know what it is and it's flying at the carrier, then we're going to take it out regardless of it's friendly or foe.
Right.
So I can start to see better, I guess, the decision matrix or the thought processes of the Gettysburg guys. So I like that. Appreciate it.
Yeah. And there's also the aspect. So let's talk about, why would Gettysburg potentially think this guy was hostile? Well, first of all, we don't know what's going on with IFF. To me, that is the linchpin of this entire discussion. And there have been reports from third parties who I know personally that, but I don't have their permission to say it here, but they've said it other places publicly, that during the workup cycle, Truman was experiencing the dump of mode 5 on the cat shot.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so let's real quick go back to the aviation side, or the hybrid aviation surface side or air control side. When you launch off the carrier, right, you're going to come up and do what in my day, and maybe they're still called this, you're going to do Parrot India checks.
Yeah, or we call them sweet and sour checks.
Sweet sour.
Same.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, we were waiting to hear Parrot India, sweet sour, or we want to hear sweet, ideally sweet sour, sour sweet. Meaning, is your IFF working? If someone, and you test them on deck, right? You check your IFF on deck before you launch.
A-firm.
But once you launch, you do your sweet sour checks, your Parrot India checks. Now, if you're sour, it's not like you're instantly back on the carrier. The bird has to go somewhere, right?
Yeah, usually a penalty box. Or actually, here's a good point to your 10 miles is you're not allowed outside 10 miles from mom.
Right.
You don't have good mode 5 checks. Yeah.
Right. So during peacetime, meaning the 90s, the early 2000s, there was no one shooting at our strike groups, especially in the 90s. It was the peace dividend. There wasn't even a threat per se. It was not impossible, I would say, to see, especially a tanker whose mission was overhead tanking, to launch and have a sour mode 4 back then check, and the decision be made, we'll keep them overhead and let them tank, because they're going to be overhead until the recovery cycle happens anyway.
So I'm with you there, but also keep in mind Ripper and Dog behind him, right? And Ripper shot at too, and Ripper is part of a DCA.
Absolutely.
Mission,
absolutely. So I'm sitting back here and going, why, how could all this happen? But again, I'm putting ideas out there of how do we not have IFF on these guys? How do we not have IFF on all three of these guys? Or maybe that's why Dog wasn't shot at, right? Like, is it possible that Dog's IFF was up? We just don't know. But
we don't.
All that being said, we can make an assumption And all military planning relies on some assumptions, and you have to make good or bad assumptions.
Sure.
I'm going to assume for our discussion that Texaco and Ripper were not broadcasting. No, let me take that back. There was not receipt of good Mode 5 IFF from Texaco and Ripper on Gettysburg.
Potentially, and I would also offer that Link 16, so somebody wasn't Sweet Timber, right? So somebody wasn't in the Wi-Fi network too, because I once again think about that correlation of the Wi-Fi network and the CIT, the transponder interrogation.
That perfect lead into what I'm thinking next. So these guys are coming back. They're coming on their route into final bearing, right? Which we talked about earlier, you and I, before we started, is sort of like almost the wide part of a funnel onto that nighttime glide slope. And at some point, we have unofficial reports that the E-2 checked out of the link. Now, if it was, you had alluded to the fact that you heard her reports that her gear went down. I made the presumption that she was just checking off station to recover, but who knows, right?
Right, absolutely.
So here's what's important. If we go back to what you described the link as, right, is this Wi-Fi network, think about it like we all have our iPhones, and we all have Find a Friend enabled, right? And we can I can tell where Shine is, and Shine can tell where I am.
Great analogy.
And potentially even you can have more than one link running an area to reduce bandwidth, right? Because you don't necessarily need the overland strikers to be seen by other people, so on and so forth. Shine can see his kids on his Find a Friend network, and I can see my friends or my kids on my Find a Friend network, and Shine and I can share data together without oversharing information about our kids, so to speak. That's a very rough analogy, but this is sort of what this link is going to look like. The problem is if a link control node goes down, such as the E2 for any reason, you now have to reestablish the link. It's not like everyone just pops in. So hearing that the E2 may have had its gear go down adds a whole nother layer of complexity even beyond maybe she just checked out a station. Because if she's going to check out a station, someone else is going to come up on the link, but it sounds like she went down and a ship took control of her assets, and she was controlling Texaco, wasn't she? The E2 was controlling Texaco. She was controlling Ripper.
Probably controlling Ripper during their AIC mission or their DCA, mission.
Yeah.
But then from there, because they were embarked on the landing, they're engaged in the landing phase. The E2 is probably not controlling them. Honestly, it's going to be CATSI, so there'll be up buttons 16 or 17, I guess.
Right.
Talking to the carrier.
Right, but as far as who's reporting them in the link, right? If they're not reporting themselves or if we're correlating link tracks, there's all these moving parts now that are going in to create a very solid link picture, because the issue with link is it's not as clean as that iPhone Find a Friend, right? Like every unit in the link has its own opinion of where it is in the world. And my radar has an opinion of where you are in the world, and the E2's radar has an opinion of where it is in the world. And all these things have to be synced up together. And as soon as one person comes out, you've got ambiguity.
Yeah, I'm with you. Keep in mind, if you don't mind, allow myself to introduce myself. But anyway, so point being is the aircraft, the F-18s now, if they are Sweet Timber, so they're dialed into the Wi-Fi, they provide their own position reporting.
Right.
Called a PPLI, right? And that PPLI is independent of any kind of E2 activity in the net.
Okay. So they should be showing their own location.
They should, yeah. So even if the E2 radar goes down, he's not painting the rhinos, and we don't care because the rhinos are going to announce into the link 16, right, or the Wi-Fi network of where they are specifically.
Okay. So now I have the question for when the investigation comes out of why did Gettysburg not recognize these were link players, right? Because by definition, a link player is not a threat. A link player is someone who's involved in the link.
Careful with my capabilities here, but sometimes bad guys can, here you go. So unclassified, bad guys can be reported in the link because they'll come from a sensor of a link participant, and then they'll be piped into the link.
Fair. Okay. So there is room for ambiguity. and without, because I want to be mindful of our time here, we can have a discussion another time about what happened in 87, 88 with the Vincennes shooting down an Iranian
89.
Airbus,
Yeah.
89.
It was 89. Yep.
And we can go on that in another time, but that was an example of where link track numbers got miscorrelated, and you got altitude data on one thing and radar data on another thing, and it made something seem to be a threat that wasn't. Totally. So it's not, even though that's, almost 40 years ago, there's precedent for these link. It's not quite as clear as there's a link track, there's a link track, there's a link track. So I guess the two questions I really have for the investigation are, why was there not solid IFF on these guys? And what was their status in the link? And why couldn't that be detected by Gettysburg? And there may be valid reasons, because now you asked me to put myself on the SWO perspective. I am on Gettysburg. I am likely the shotgun cruiser, which means I'm the ship that is tasked with the obligation of making sure nothing strikes the carrier. And as we talked about before, I'm probably not going to do anything to a weapon that's to an inbound missile that's within 10 miles. Because at that point, my missile may do as much damage to the carrier as anything else, right? I don't want to be shooting SM-2s at the carrier to try and tail chase the thing that's coming at her. I don't even want a crossing shot. So,
Totally agree.
so now we're talking about planes that we think were about 15 miles behind the carrier, right? So time is now running short for the Gettysburg to make a decision on things that are flying at probably one-way-ish altitude, that are flying at one-way-ish speeds. They have no radars, right? They don't have it, or at least we're not getting emissions of an APG-79, which would immediately make me go, that is a friendly in this scenario, right? And
I would offer up that I bet their radars are still turned on.
You think so?
Landing.
Okay.
Yeah, I never went to radar standby. That wasn't part of my approach checks. So
Really?
I tend to think, for safety of flight things. So you got link, but you got your radar on still.
Really? So for us, I'm just thinking about when we would land helicopters, and granted, an Aegis spy radar is a lot more powerful in terms of wattage output than an APG, but that was a pretty clear thing, because Aegis has been known to fry aircraft, if we don't sector it out.
So in your assumption, were you saying that the landing aircraft, you were assuming the landing aircraft turned their radar off for the approach?
Yeah, I assumed that they went to standby on their radars. That was my understanding of the fence outs.
Oh, no.
No, okay.
Respectfully disagree. Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, you're the guy who flew aircraft. I'm the guy who watched them go overhead.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's another wrinkle now is, were their radars on? If
Probably.
they were on, this should have been a pretty good, hey, is that thing radiating? Like, that would be one of the checks, right? Like when I was sitting TAO on my destroyer and you got a radar contact, one of the first questions was, do I have ESM off this guy, right? Am I getting a Cyrano radar off a Mirage? Am I getting the Soviet-made radars are escaping me now, are pro words for them. Do I think I got an Su-24 inbound on me? Oh, it's an APG. All right, that's a Striker coming back. So that's one more question I want to have answered. But and there's a potential that word just never made it across CIC. I know that sounds crazy, but if the EW, electronic warfare operator, is like, no, I don't get a return off that guy for whatever reason or whatever. One more piece that could have identified, right? If we go to the Swiss cheese model, we just need one piece to not be in alignment and the holes don't all line up.
Yeah, I'm with you. Hey, one thing, Roger.
Yeah.
So folks at home, if they're informed, they may be aware of MCON procedures, so emissions control, right? So that is a traditional tactic for carriers to use in the combat arena. But the unofficial reports there mention that the strikers, as they're coming in on their approach, they're going to check in on buttons 16 and 17. And so to me, checking in means transmitting on the radio.
Yep.
So I tend to think this was not an MCON recovery. So another reason why the radars are probably emitting stuff.
Okay. So again, when we see the report finally, another question, why did radar not identify this to Gettysburg? Why did IFF not identify this to Gettysburg? Why did Link not identify this to Gettysburg?
And and you have two cases of that, right? You got Texaco as well as Ripper.
And a Ripper.
So
Right.
if you're aligning the Swiss cheese, it seems like a unique probability anyway that,
Yes.
that both aircrew would have all those emissions turned off. So
Right.
so from that perspective, if it's a gremlin in the system, we'll call it, not human
Yeah.
error, but some kind of electronic hiccup, I tend to think it may be on the Gettysburg side as opposed to occurring sequentially or simultaneously, in both of the approaching aircraft.
Right. And it is worth noting that we're close to midnight Zulu when this is happening, which is when all the U.S. military's crypto, that's not a secret, we're not giving anything away. U.S. military changes its crypto at midnight Zulu all around the world. Zulu
Correct.
being Greenwich Mean Time or UDC. So we don't know why, but let's presume let's make a presumption for the moment that this was not gross human error, right? That, oh, I have EW and it's a link track, but F it, I'm going to shoot it anyway. Let's assume it's not a gross electronic error where Aegis allowed a shot on a friendly.
I agree.
For whatever reason, Gettysburg identifies these 15-ish miles behind the carrier. Well, now put yourself in the mindset of that TAO who says, my mandate is to get these guys before they hit the carrier. Not only are they 5 miles from that bubble where I'm really uncomfortable shooting into because of where the carrier is, these things are also angling into Marshall. Now, if I were flying a drone, if I were trying to use a one-way suicide attack, I would fly those things right up the Marshall pattern. Because now the Navy has two options. You can either scatter your Marshall stack with God only knows what, effect, right? Who's going to now be low on fuel? What procedure do we have for scattering the Marshall stack? Or I'm going to be faced with the option of shooting into the Marshall stack, which is something I never want to do. Refer back to our how close do you want to shoot to a friendly aircraft?
I'm with you. Yes, if you're going to talk bad guy tactics,
Yeah.
if I want to get my threat close to my target, whatever it may be, I would kind of hide in plain sight in a very populated area. So
Right.
that would be the approach corridor, we'll say, to the
Right.
carrier. Yep.
So those are my SWO thoughts. And I will say that going into our discussion or, our pre-call before we sat here, I did not see a way that Gettysburg could in any way have been exonerated for this happening, because it just seemed so odd to me that we'd be down on link, down on, I assumed the radars were off, but now that makes it even worse hearing that they were on. And then IFF down. But the thing that occurred to me, I'm sitting here, I'm going, but the Gettysburg CO hasn't been relieved.
Well, to
Yeah.
our knowledge, right?
To our knowledge, I'm just saying, like, in the back of my mind, I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And then I brought that up to say, you have a piece of information that we have to admit is unsubstantiated, right?
Correct.
Are you
Unofficial
comfortable
report.
sharing that?
Absolutely. So as
Yeah.
you could imagine, the shipboard, basically all of naval systems, to my knowledge, at least what I know in the aircraft and what I've heard of on the ships, they have a recording capability of the displays, right? So you can hit rewind, you can watch it again for mission debriefs, for training, all that kind of stuff. Or if there's any kind of incident like there was in this case, they can have someone else, a third party, watch the tapes and see what they thought. And so there's an unofficial report from a surface warfare officer that they watched the tapes. That would be the tapes from the Gettysburg. And he or she feels that the watch team would have done the same thing, made the same decision that was made, obviously, of launching the SM2s against the two, we'll just call them inbound bogies, which turned out to be F-18. So for me, based on that unofficial report, it seems like there must be some kind of a display limitation or system limitation. And it sounds like it may be on the Gettysburg, as opposed to the probabilities we talked about earlier of both aircraft having the same issues that align the holes in the Swiss cheese model, if you will. So,
Right.
And that's unofficial. I don't know the validity or the experience level, let's say, of the person who generated the report. But it also, these guys are engaged in combat operations, fog of war, Roger, that you know well. So, and then we talked about the weighing the probabilities of, would you rather have the carrier damaged with the aircraft and people on board, or would you rather shoot down one of your own? So the decision matrix is somewhat convoluted. It's on an accelerated schedule, as you had mentioned. You know, these aircraft or inbound bogies are probably going about, what we say, 300 knots, let's say, for easy mass, to divide by 60, right? So you're looking at 5 miles a minute. And if they're at 15 miles, they have 1 minute until they hit mom's, we'll call it the 10 nautical mile standoff area. So not a lot of time, fog of war, I would say. So I could see, someone not getting fired or relieved. And even if they were, I don't see a reason why the Navy has to report that to the U.S. immediately, because they're engaged in combat. And why show any kind of weakness of change of command during combat operations?
Yeah. So again, reiterating, that's an unconfirmed report. All of these reports are unconfirmed.
Yep.
As media channels change, I think we can sort of have varying degrees of confidence in these reports. And what you shared with me, the phrasing of it makes me fully believe it came from a surface warfare officer, or at least a naval officer. Right,
okay,
like
jargon,
the phrasing, the jargon made me go, okay, this feels about right.
Okay, well, that's good.
Was there a part of the report that said there was actually a senior officer involved, that also the initial quick look was that senior official would have agreed with that, or was I reading too much into that?
A little bit, too much. And then I guess I have the luxury of not knowing all the SWO terms. So but basically, they said that based on the information that was available via the displays, that they concurred with what the watch team did that night. So they being, I don't know if it was a senior guy. I'm assuming it was a senior guy reviewing some tapes, if you will.
Okay.
But unaware of the level or rank, or experience level of the reviewer.
Yeah. Now I will say one thing that makes me pause on the report, and you and I talked about this earlier, is that on older versions of Aegis, if you had an incident, I was involved in an incident where I had to do this as a combat systems officer. We had an aircraft crash with fatalities. Our Aegis tapes were evidence. So there had been an aviation incident. We had to pull the tapes. We could not replay them. That was not allowed. We boxed them. The two-person integrity, signatures on the tape, the whole thing. And now, it's worth noting Gettysburg had just been one of the few cruisers to come out of that service life extension program that's so controversial. The report that they replayed it and looked at it is not enough for me to call BS, so to speak, on it, because I don't know what upgrades they had. They may very well have that capability, but it's just a little thing in the corner of my mind
Gotcha.
to think about there.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll say is, it sounds very simple. And then it would, after I say this, I'll let you get the last word, Shine, but it sounds very simple to say, how come they couldn't figure this out? And I will just say that I have been on a ship an Aegis ship that launched a missile that we thought, and you and I have talked about this in our SM2 episode, we launched on an F-4 Phantom that was still in service at the time as launching a drone. And our air warfare commander, my CO, was a little bit skeptical because there were some little indicators that we should not be shooting at this thing. And Alpha Whiskey told us shoot, so we shot, and we ended up having to self-destruct the missiles in flight. That's number one. So that pressure, that time pressure, because we were sitting there going, there's not time to argue about it. We're going to miss the shot.
Yep.
If it is actually the drone we're shooting at. The other thing is real world. I was part of a strike group that actually launched DLI, deck launched intercept, to go full blooded, bit in the teeth, get ready to master arm on what turned out to be a U.S. strategic reconnaissance asset exiting the airspace of a notionally hostile country.
Whoops.
Well, because we didn't have the information to the point, right? So essentially what happened was we launched the DLI. DLI goes full burner to go see this thing because it's coming almost directly at the strike group out of a country we were not very friendly with.
Sure.
They were going pretty fast. And what eventually happened was the carrier had to get on the radio and basically do a, hey, I know you're under control of that ship, but this is, Jimmy from your roommate in the stateroom. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but the carrier had knowledge, which is common, I'm sure you've seen this, had knowledge we were not privy to that was like, hey, that's not something you should be launching DLI on, especially not thinking it might have hostile intent. An accident can happen, come home.
Absolutely. And what I've noticed just from combat, I guess as we wrap up here in the next 2 minutes or so, Roger, is that fog of war, I've seen it. It's real. Time compression, or I should say actually the anxiety associated with short timelines.
Yeah.
Not necessarily time compressions, all played a factor into this. And for me, that manifested as selective attention, if you will. So not looking at all the information, looking, kind of glomming on to one thing or two things. So I don't know if it's human error or not, but I think the big takeaway is that there are not one, but two miracles that night. First one, the aircrew ejected prior to getting hit by the missile. So they survived, obviously. And then the second miracle is going to be the second aircraft, in our case, Ripper, right? And that is that they were able to maneuver and get out of the way of the inbound missile, and so it missed them. So we lost no life. We did lose a replaceable aircraft, and I think there'll be some good lessons learned coming out of this whole thing.
And maybe not quite to the level of a miracle, but both guys ejected with, I guess, minor injuries to one of the crew members, and they both got picked out of a dark sea in the middle of the night. Neither of those things are givens.
Amen. Very true. So.
All right. Shine, thank you for your time. Everyone listening, if more information becomes available, we'll be back. Any questions, you can go ahead and submit them to the show at support@authenticmedia.io. And thanks for listening.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Roger.
Absolutely.